I will go on mute. Thanks everyone for coming. I'm thrilled you're here. I can't wait to hear what you have to say.
Thanks, Chris. Hi again, Rachel. So just for context, it's only been, was it a year or 2 years, Rachel? It feels like it's,
Maybe like a year and a half.
yeah. So like I feel like we met at a social impact supper club, which is a gathering that I sometimes have the privilege to host in New York, where we bring together some really lovely people who work in social impact, but don't often get the space to just kind of hang out with each other in a, I don't know, like a person, like in a personally resourcing way instead of a professionally resourcing way. And the lovely thing about the one that we met at was it was all about Adrienne Marie Brown's work on interdependence. And so we actually worked through what it means to be seen, be wrong, ask for and receive what you need, and bring your whole self. And it was a really lovely conversation about how easy it is to be wrong for some of us and how hard, like to be wrong first for some of us, right? Like it's super easy for me to be wrong because of who I am and what I look like. People just assume that I'm moving fast and breaking stuff. And I always assumed that was somebody else's experience too. And I learned a lot about like other people's experiences going through really interesting things in that moment. But during that conversation, one of the people in the room was Rachel, and I learned about two things. One, her book, Black Capitalist, that she was working on at the time, and I was deeply intrigued by that. And two, her work with her business, Kelly Welle, which is a plantain-based food business in New York that I was also equally as excited about. So we went to coffee, and I just became deeply enamored of the work that Rachel is throwing herself into, that is deeply important. Her rich sort of just lived experience and like commitment to the academic research and the depth of the research that she put into it, the commitment to having what was sort of anticipated to be a spirited conversation, probably just because of the framing of the work and even just like your journey, Rachel, even inside just the academic sort of the challenges that people put up to you, even inside academia before you took it out into the real world. But really seeing and believing and wanting to encourage and sort of just come along for the ride on this idea of collective thriving, even inside of, or maybe especially because of the system that it was trying to happen inside of, and that it was only going to happen because of these hard conversations. And getting to sort of then follow Rachel from like through all the social media channels of the launch of the book, the conversations that started happening while she was moving through this journey, like through the US and around the world, of book chats and sort of the surprising and sort of thoughtful and challenging conversations that started happening around it, and how much that started to feel like the social impact professional's life as well, of like, I'm trying so hard to do good. I got into this to do good from inside the system, but I still find myself challenged both from the outside of does that really matter, and from the inside of is what I'm doing mattering, to the point where sometimes it almost feels like, cognitive dissonance, maybe moral injury, even depending on like how hard it is where you are to do what you're doing and what's going on with someplace else in your company, while they're saying, go make us look good out in the community and make the employees love us. And you're like, oh, I don't know how I feel about this inside of my heart. But it's seeing so much similarity between the work Rachel does out there and the work Rachel does, and what this group of folks largely does inside. So wanting to bring those together. And I know I am pretty much going to stop talking because I don't experience a whole lot of that. And I just want to hear from other folks who do and are going to have a really rich conversation. So like Chris said, please jump in the chat as much as you want, and know that we're going to invite folks to speak after. I would love to save the introduce yourself for like if and when you have a question. Just sort of give us your personal background as context for where your question comes from. That way we can get right into Rachel giving us the conversation. I think that's enough of me talking. I would love for some context from you, Rachel, and I'm just really excited to hand all this over and turn myself on mute.
Awesome. Thank you, Tim. Hi, everybody. Again, just by way of introduction, before I kind of speak to some thoughts anchored on this theme, being in but not of, I do a few different things. Being an author is the most or the newest identity that I've added to the list. As Tim spoke to, I published Black Capitalist, a blueprint for what is possible earlier this year, this past June, with Penguin Random House. And that work is really all about how race makes a difference and how we participate in capitalism. And that difference teaches all of us something about how to create a more equitable version of the political economy. I'll circle back to that. I also, in terms of my day job, I work at JP Morgan Chase. And I've been in the financial services industry for some time. I've had two different roles currently. I work in wealth management research. But my first role here at the firm was in racial equity work. And you might be familiar with JP Morgan's racial equity commitment, which was launched back in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd, really in an effort to close the racial wealth gap. And so the work that I did on that team was strategic deployment of the 30 billion investable assets that the firm had to offer for that commitment. And, it was a 5-year commitment. It's actually reaching gestation this year. And so there's been a whole evolution of that work. Can also mention I'm a founder of Killer Lily, where we do all things plantains and travel. We have this like really fun beach lodge in a place called Mafia Island off the coast of Tanzania as a way to bridge culture, food, creativity, rest, all on the continent. So those are some of the things that I do. And I think the through line has always been in the space of race, money, social good, ethical entrepreneurship. Um, but when it comes to the book, which I'm circling back on now, which has really kind of shaped so much of my thinking, both intellectually, but also the embodied practice of what it means to be in but not of spaces. I think even the title, Black Capitalist, really speaks to the tension. Um, you know, as I've been touring and I'll talk to people, we all for the maxim is like don't judge a book by its cover, but sometimes we're still guilty of that. And so people will say, oh, before I even read it, I had a visceral reaction to this idea of putting black next to capitalists. And there can be all kinds of assumptions about what that means or what kind of story you're trying to tell. And I think for me, the focus has always been in how can you acknowledge and sit and really wrestle with the tension of what it means to be in a particular system, in this case, an economic system, capitalism, while still acknowledging the harms of it, but recognizing that it is embedded with tools that, if used subversively or with intention or strategy, can create different outcomes. And I think for me, that thinking really came from my own evolution of what it meant for me to be in, but not of certain spaces. And so to give you context for this, I studied social and cultural analysis at NYU for undergrad. That was my training. And so much of that training was really built in. Sorry if you can hear the noise behind me, but the scholarship on racial capitalism. And that scholarship, rooted within Black studies, really aims to make the argument that capitalism is predicated on the exploitation of difference understood in different forms, whether it be race, gender, class, etc. Race being a kind of master status that often becomes a point of difference that then gets exploited. There's an extraction of people from their value and what they create in service of the kind of hallmarks of capitalism, which is private ownership and profitability, usually now in the context of infinite growth. And so with that kind of framework, it became this narrative that for Black people, especially when you consider the history of the creation of American capitalism, predicated on legalized slavery. And so it's hard to imagine a scenario whereby you can have the tools of capitalism create a kind of benefit or mutual beneficiary experience for Black people and that relationship to the system. And so that was my thinking. That's what I was trained up in. But then I started my career at Goldman Sachs while I was an undergrad, got kind of recruited to do that work in corporate social responsibility. And that was the first time that I kind of had a paradigm shift because I was seeing Black professionals fully aware of and grappling with the tensions of what it meant for them to even physically be on Wall Street, for them to employees of a place like Goldman Sachs and kind of sit with the tension of that, but then also have a kind of subversive outlook in terms of saying, okay, I can appreciate and acknowledge all of the problematics here, but also be intentional about how I can use tools that are available to me in this system in order to create outcomes for myself, but most importantly, my community as well. And that really forced me to think about how do I make sense of this? Because in my training, it was really around how can we resist kind of capitalist forces? How do we resist the kind of economic system that we're presented with and have to navigate this one that we've inherited? And I was being presented with a new kind of set of lived experiences that really kind of challenged that. And not to say or make the argument that capitalism is good by any means, but really to reorient what does it mean to have agency within a system that creates oppression, that really marginalized people and disenfranchises groups of people. Like, what does it mean to still have power within that context? And so that, I think, really started my journey of wrestling with the dissonance and tension of what it means to be in a space, but not of it. And I think I experienced that in different ways. That first one being, working at Goldman, and a lot of my peers at that time were going to arguably more altruistic careers. And I was making the decision to go to a place like Goldman and really thinking through the material consequences of that and what does it mean for me personally, even as a Black woman, to be doing CSR work at a place like Goldman. But then fast forward, I think going and shifting ultimately to go to academia, and I did my doctoral work at Yale, and I was both in the anthropology and the Black Studies department. And in that time, I went and I had this idea that all that I had learned at Goldman, all that I had seen evidence for about how you can be in but not of spaces in service of, I wanted to study that in a kind of academic sense. And it was in the Black Studies department that I got my fiercest kind of criticism and pushback, where people would say, Black capitalists don't exist. At best, Black people can be financiers, but they can't be capitalists. This was some of the feedback that I would receive. And to me, to be in its own system, academia, and to wrestle with what it means to be in that space of knowledge production, and especially in Black studies and anthropology, but to have a very kind of contrary opinion about how the tools of capitalism can be used and who gets to decide how those tools are used. And I think my pushback and wrestling with the dissonance of what does it mean to be in a Black studies department trained in the scholarship on racial capitalism, but to offer a new lens or an intervention about historically how we've thought about the relationship between race, money, and especially Blackness. And to do it in a time where people had very visceral reactions to the story that I was presenting. And I think what made it complex and nuanced was that so much of the criticism that I was received was not just in light of the historicity that people were referencing in terms of Black people's relationship to capitalism, but then also to suggest a kind of moral high ground about how we as people should relate to the economic system, which honestly doesn't always jive with how life is lived in reality. I think it's easy enough to say we should be resistant of systems or to critique them, but that doesn't make space for the reality of the fact that these are the systems that we navigate every day, and that there are real demands on our lives to sustain ourselves, and that requires resources. So the harder thing to do is to sit in the tension of all of that. And how do we make sense of it? And so that then I think became just another evolution of what does it mean in, but not of a space, but to also propose another way we can think about engaging systems. Because to that point I made earlier about why does any of this matter, or what are the stakes of this, is that we're always in evolution towards something else. You can appreciate that where we're at now in terms of society and the systems that make up society is not working for us. And we can also point to a more hopeful future and have ideas about what that might look like. But then we have to reckon with in between space of we're not there, we're here. So how do we get there? And I think that's where that dissonance really starts to show up, of just the reality of we are in something that is not our final destination. And so while we engage in it, we also have to behave in a way that's reflective of where we're going. And I think that's really coalesced now in practice in terms of the work that I do here at JP Morgan Chase. I think that my first role, as I mentioned, is part of the racial equity commitment team. And I'm sure as many folks in the room, operating in spaces around social impact and social good, the affirmative action ruling that came out a couple of years ago really kind of rocked our world and the work that we were doing, whereby, we weren't everyone on the team. To give you an example, where we were instructed not to talk publicly about the future of the work that we were going to do, if it was going to yet another 5-year cycle or whatever it was, because there was such fear of legal retribution. And that inspired a lot of questions internally for me around, man, well, what does it mean for me to be a Black woman, be a practitioner of DE&I work, and to also be an employee of an institution that was making a decision about its support of, or its leadership in, driving racial equity commitments and work. And that was difficult to kind of sit in because I'd never been on the like end-to-end cycle of a racial equity initiative like that. And certainly dissonance, informs that experience. And I think one of the biggest learnings for that for me was around speaking the language of the institution and being very strategic and even subversive if need be, in order to arrive at the outcomes that I know are in service of what I'm looking for, but also the institution outcome. Especially because our motivations or our drivers for those outcomes are not the same. And I think that became really important for me to see around like, how can I be, really intentional about crafting narratives or initiatives that are going to pique the interest of my stakeholders, and also get their buy-in, because there's no real altruism at a place like JP Morgan Chase, and can be honest about that. And so now to be in wealth management, historically this business has catered to predominantly white men, affluent white men. And when I think about what is the racial equity work that I get to do subversively or, front and center now, it's really about how can I rinse the language, to speak to their needs in order to work. I'll give you an example of this. So historically, the firm, when you think about or talk about the notion of financial inclusion, that's often like when I say financial inclusion, what my stakeholders might hear is people who don't have money. And then they automatically think, oh, that's not profitable. Whatever Rachel's going to say next, it's not profitable. We're not going to do it. But actually, it's the case that when you think about models of velocity and how we can acknowledge the fact that due to systemic inequality, there are pockets of population around that we have not engaged with. And to really kind of reshift and upend how our stakeholders think about financial inclusion, not from a place of a lack, but actually from a place of there's considerable business opportunity if it's framed in a particular way. And then that becomes the entry point to a conversation that otherwise I would not have been able to have if I had positioned it differently. And so I think that becomes so much of the work when I talk about systems change. It's like, okay, I recognize the language of the current system. How can I use it to my benefit in order to create an output that actually looks more like the system that we're trying to evolve into? So I just offer that as like some thinking around. I've thought about it, some of the learnings that I've had along the way, and even how I apply it to work now that I'm doing. And I can pause there. I see so many notes in the chat. That's awesome. But yeah, would love to kind of hear from you and how you all think about dissonance and being in spaces of being in a system as we evolve into the new ones. And what are the strategies and tactics that you kind of deploy to make that happen?
Perfect.
Oh,
Oh, are people coming off mute to talk? I had something blocking my screen. Go for it. Going back on mute. Thank you.
oh yeah, I was gonna jump in. Rachel, it's so great to meet you, and thank you for sharing all of that and your process and your background. And I'm like extremely impressed and intimidated all at the same time. And it's so interesting. I mean, like you said, your title, Black Capitalists, is immediately a controversial pairing of words. So a quick background is sort of Tim mentioned to sort of give quick intros. So I'm currently a social worker. I'm a licensed therapist. I had a background in more macro level work. So I worked for Consumer Reports for a couple of years. I worked for a social impact agency doing a lot of corporate social responsibility in quotes at a place called Purpose. So some of the work that I did at Consumer Reports was around discriminatory car insurance pricing and working state by state to improve some of those policies to make assessments and pricing for car insurance more equitable. When I was at Purpose, we had a client with Freddie Mac, I forget which one, I think it was Freddie Mac. And it was terms of closing the racial wealth gap with home ownership. So investigating a lot of the racism and bias with home assessments, with mortgage approvals, and a lot of strategy work and digging into what actionable solutions could be. So as a campaigner, a lot of the dissonance that I felt was so much of the work played in this theater of strategy, that we would talk and talk and talk and talk and talk and research and research and research and research and play with all these different diagrams to show you what a possible solution was. And my frustration came with when is the rubber going to hit the road? We know what the solutions are. We knew what the solutions were 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. If we need to dress it up in a new language and make it sparkly for people to be activated, that's very understandable to motivate momentum again for a new generation of change makers trying to make it happen. So I would oftentimes look to impact measurement and learning, this whole field of like IML. And sometimes in the IML space, people would dress up metrics to make it seem like a success happened. But when you really scratch the surface, it was like nothing changed, actually. There was no sort of measurable shift in, let's say, closing the racial wealth gap or the increase in mortgages that were approved for certain communities. So I'm curious in terms of like your work and what you've witnessed at Goldman and at JP Morgan, particularly in what you mentioned with this 5-year plan and this gestation period kind of coming up this year. Have there been exciting metrics, exciting successes in terms of like what that looks like to close the racial wealth gap?
Great question. And I'll say that, or I'll speak to the time in which I was still on the team, because I think now they're in process of, creating reports around output and impact and whatnot. But in terms of how that commitment was structured, it was focused on core indices for how we measure wealth. And so we looked at specifically home ownership as an indicator for wealth, financial health and wellness, and then also business banking and access to capital for entrepreneurs. There were several other ones like affordable housing, et cetera, but those were the kind of three core indicators. And so we were able to just, measure what the home ownership rates, for example, look like amongst white people as opposed to Black, Latino, and Hispanic folks. And so that's where we kind of catalyzed our different verticals, like the home lending business, to say, what can be done to close this gap? And so one thing that the home lending business did was to create a first-time home buyer initiative, where they said that if you are buying a home in a predominantly Black, Latino, making the assumption that it would be a Black, Latino, or Hispanic person buying that home, we will support you and give you, at the time, I think it was $5,000. They've, I think, increased it since. We didn't account for gentrification or other factors, but that was part of the initiative. And so now, or at least part of the work that I was doing on the strategy front, is we built a community research. And what that aimed to do was to look at zip codes and use zip codes as a proxy for race to understand deposits within particular communities versus loans made by the firm to people in those communities, to be able to say at any given time, if I look at, say, Miami-Dade County, I can see how many loans the bank has given to this Black community within this zip code region versus how many loans have been given to a Black or a white community nearby, but then also how many deposits are we collecting from that Black community as well. And the numbers were horrendous, as you might imagine. And what's also, I think, and part of why I was like, oh, I need to shift out of this space, because that engine essentially looked like a redlining map. And it meant that maybe 5 people had access to that engine, because now you're getting into a whole new space of, oh, this could open us up to a lot of legal retribution. And we have to think very carefully about the regulations that we're now upholding ourselves to. The moment you archive this, like, we're responsible for addressing the issue. And so that started to, I think, problematize the opportunity for real impact once we started to look and really quantify the inequity at that point. And I think part of the tension inherent in that is like the way in which that commitment was designed and where it sat within the business was not a setup for success. And I say that because it started in the home lending business, which is a profitable business for the firm, but then it transitioned into a corporate sector function. And I think oftentimes you'll see DE&I initiatives, at least within, say, financial institutions, will exist in a non-revenue generating division of the organization. And so when you then start to think about cost effectiveness and where should we make cuts, these are the initiatives that start to go. And I think when you overlay the sociopolitical climate on things, it becomes very easy to then say, oh, we're getting rid of this or this or this. And then the impact becomes, I wouldn't say none, but not as great as it could have been because of all of these different factors. And so it's why when I think about impact now, it really matters where the initiative or the effort is even positioned from the get-go in order to drive sustainability for the long term, because otherwise it then becomes a 5-year commitment that we can just wash our hands of afterwards and say that we did it and it's satisfied perhaps stakeholder interest, if not shareholder interest, and it existed within the zeitgeist, you know, and it didn't really have the opportunity to really kind of make the change that it could otherwise have had. Whereas now, to be in the wealth management space, and how I think about the work that I do is, all right, if we can build um, wealth experiences that speak to Black, Latino, and Hispanic communities, and the starting point is actually to work with affluent clients. And that becomes almost like the subversion, because we say financial inclusion, we're not talking about folks without investable assets. I'm actually talking about folks who have a lot of investable assets. So stakeholders are hooked to that. But what you do when you actually build that out is you create this kind of curb cut effect that it then becomes accessible for others who are not affluent. And that way we actually sketch a road for what does it mean to go from saving to investing to actually building wealth. Now we get to account for that, when if it was just positioned as financial inclusion for, say, our starter segments, we would have never been able to now have the tech capacity and the budget to build it. And it's underway now. And so I think impact gets to look a lot different based on where you start and how you kind of be strategic and, again, speaking the language of the business and creating impact, because by mid-year next year, we'll be able to say that we've built this product or tool. And, you know, the firm can be happy about that and meet certain metrics, but then I can also get to know that the internal metrics that I had also got to see the light of day, you know?
Rachel, can I ask a follow-up question to that, which is more about the personal journey that you went on? And I'm really curious about this. Like, that feels smart, clever, thoughtful, insightful. It also feels like you did a lot of that work on your own to figure that out and sort of go on that journey and learn how to recognize your own, like how to work with the dissonance you were feeling into like a productive outcome. And I'm kind of curious about, from you and maybe some other folks on the call who've gone through that sort of journey of, this doesn't feel right. I need some resourcing on how to manage this not feeling right into a thing that makes me feel like I've got some agency over changing this a little bit. And I'm really like, was there a mentor? Was there a resource group? Was there a space where you could talk about this? Or did you have to do all this work on your own to sort of get here? And then after we hear from you, I'd love to hear if anybody else has like a similar or different sort of journey that you had to take to get here from there.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
remember, throw your questions in. If you have something to add, ask or offer, throw it in. Because I'm looking weird doing it myself. Okay.
I love that question because no, none of it I did alone. And I think a theory that I love, which is so pragmatic, and I'll kind of share it and then show you how it kind of shows up, is this theory of the undercommons. Again, within the context of Black studies, where I first learned about it, two scholars, Fred Moten and Stefano Harney, created this concept of the undercommons. And it's this idea that, and they use the kind of academic space as the example for it, where they say, we can't be naive enough to believe that the institution, the academic institution, is a place of enlightenment. You can't go there and actually believe you're going to be enlightened. But you also can't ignore the fact that that institution is a place ripe with resources. And part of why you can't, you know, be naive enough to believe that you'll actually be enlightened is because these systems reproduce inequality. And so what you do, especially as a person who's experienced some form of marginalization, you occupy the undercommon space, and it becomes this shared space whereby other folks who've also experienced some form of marginalization on account of the institution, they create community with one another. And it's the act of quite literally sharing resources, capital of different forms, social capital, human capital, monetary capital, to create new outcomes for the folks within that undercommons, but then also for their communities that are attached to them. And one example of even the undercommons today. So at the firm, you know, we have employee resource groups, and those are formalized. I wouldn't say those are undercommons because they're mandated by the institution. But one undercommon space was one that was organically created by employees, and it's called the African Alliance. And so on a monthly basis, we get on a Zoom call like this one, and it's hundreds of folks from around the world who work at JP Morgan Chase, and of African descent. And we literally share resources, talk about what are opportunities in which to engage with each other, reckon with the dissonance, and have kind of like a talk therapy about how it is that we manage this in real time and support each other. And that's become a really huge and pivotal space for me. And so, and I've had some notion of the undercommons throughout my own evolution. I would argue this Zoom call right now is its own undercommons of how we can be in community with each other, share resources, share experiences to help make sense of the distance. And so I would say, Tim, that's been a huge way for me to be in community and, sense making for what it means to be in a system while trying to behave as if you're in something else.
I love that, Rachel. Thank you. I love the idea that, yeah, let's do it under comments all the time. Who else? Go ahead, Chris. I saw you, and then Tessa, if you want to talk after.
Sorry, I didn't use the little hand. Thank you so much, Rachel. My name is Chris, and I'm in Portland, Oregon, and I have a organizational development firm, and we also do social impact work. But we work with a lot of nonprofit and also government, like cities, counties, clients. And anyway, I was really struck by what you just said that about the undercommons, and because you had said earlier about this tension between what we're sitting in, but not losing hope. And I was curious about that. Like, I was going to ask that, how you kind of keep that hope. But one thing I just thought of is, I don't know if you've ever read any Alexa Pauline Gumbs. She wrote Undrowned, it's Black feminist lessons from marine mammals. And she talks about how dolphins spell each other, for breathing. So you have a school, a pod of dolphins, and they live in community and they uphold each other. Those that need help coming to the surface get help. Those that have more power, stay down. And when you said that about the undercommons, I was like, that's what that is. Because one of the ways that I struggle with keeping hope is when I feel alone in it, and it's finding the resources it's also my responsibility to not give up. And so how do I put myself in spaces where I can get resources from others who might have more strength in that moment? And so I'm just curious if you have other ways, because you are in a really interesting setting where it could be really hard to hold on to hope of a system change.
Yeah. I think so much of what I'm doing is what you've already kind of spoken to around just like that deep sense of self-accountability and responsibility to continue to kind of show up and be a seed of hope, but then also leaning in on community in times where I do feel a little hopeless or it's threatened. I will say, I think another huge factor for me keeping a sense of hopefulness is my faith practice. If I'm very honest with you, I think that's been a huge source for me in terms of equipping me with some kind of bravery, or at least enough bravery to overcome fear or worry or anxiety about, the moments that we're in, and just keeping my eye focused on, again, like that next iteration of how we can be in better community with each other. And so, yeah, I think my faith really is the foundation for that. And the community gets to build upon that. And then also myself and my commitment to this work and showing up and living life the way that I think is indicative of that future state. So those are the key pieces.
Hey, Rachel, I'm Tessa. Oh, sorry, Chris, go ahead.
No, I was just going to take advantage of the pause to say goodbye in person instead of just in the notes, and that we'll follow up with everybody afterwards. Rachel, thank you so much. Okay, this is awesome. This is really great. I love it. Okay, bye, everyone.
I'm Tessa. I oversee the community impact function for a staffing and consulting firm called Robert Half. I'm based in Philadelphia. And One of the reasons this talk appealed to me is because I feel like I resonated with the subject of just trying to like create change, trying to create culture change in a system where, you know, the work that I'm doing is kind of seen as a nice to have. It's so altruistic. It's great that people volunteer or whatever. But people don't really have kind of the 360 holistic view of what social impact work could achieve, you know, if the business is aligned in that way. So um, my question to you is, how do you decide, or what are the things you look for to show you that change is possible? Because sometimes you can't really change the environment, like the system that you're in is really stacked against you, and you're not going to set yourself on fire to keep others warm. So how do you sort of balance, you know, the work that you do to try and change things with also protecting your energy and space and all of that?
That's
And
a
when do
great,
you know, and what are you looking for? What are the indicators that you pick up on to just to make that distinction?
that's a great question. I think what comes to mind for me is I will, or how I might determine if change is actually possible within a space that I'm in or institution that I'm a part of, is if there is ambiguity around how a tool can be leveraged. If we haven't made hard and fast rules about an output that we expect when we leverage a tool, then there's opportunity in my mind around how we can then use it in order to create maybe a spectrum of outputs. And so one example of that I think is actually a great case study in the case of one of the entrepreneurs that I kind of spotlight in the book is two co-founders, Wamimu Abbey and Nicole. They co-founded a fintech company called Isusu. Not sure if anyone's familiar with it. The idea is they create financial visibility for the country's most financially invisible people. And I mean, they won't say it, certain audiences, but it's really aimed to create access to capital specifically for Black, Latino, and Hispanic folks, and namely folks who are immigrants as well, because we know that one of the greatest indicators of wealth and the puzzle pieces for that is being able to have access to credit. And so if you don't have financial visibility, you have no credit history, you're not going to get access to capital and build from there. And so I think what's great about their work is that they started in 2018, used the tools of capitalism, created a very kind of tried and true kind of startup model. They got VC funding, all under the auspices of being able to say that, hey, can acknowledge that people who are renters, they should be able to, if they pay their rent on time regularly, that should say something about their credit worthiness, right? And that should add to their credit history. And that became the entry point for them to build a startup that could translate into, you know, for your Sally Mae, whatever, build credit, and then say, okay, not only are these folks credit or financially visible who otherwise wouldn't have been, now we're able to deploy billions of dollars of capital to folks who otherwise wouldn't have been able to access it. And so initially when they were starting Isusu, I think on the face of it, the outcomes can be ambiguous, but still assuming, oh, they're going to be profitable, they're going to create something that's fully beneficial to their investors, but to do it in a way where now they're able to say that this is a way we actually think about change tangibly when it comes to the racial wealth gap, because we're able to redistribute capital. We're also able to give people the tool, one key tool of capitalism, credit, that they otherwise historically and structurally haven't been able to access. And so that to me, you know, you could say the idea of building a fintech company like that, you don't know if it's actually going to create change, but because there's, I think, that element of business, like good business is good business. And so then you get the opportunity to create that kind of subversive change as a byproduct of it just good business. But I think it speaks to the fact that you're using the tool of credit in a way that, depending on your audience, they might not know that you're trying to drive towards a particular outcome. And that becomes the ambiguity that I'm talking about. And that's kind of an exciting space to be. But when there's hard and fast rules about what the outcome could be, I don't think then that's indicative of potential change. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Hi, everyone. My name's Alana. Nice to meet you. And Rachel, I realized Tessa sent me this and I was like, I know her face. I know Rachel's face. And I realized that I met you at the Africa Center when I used to work there. So nice to see you
Oh my
again.
gosh.
and to
Hey.
see how much more
Wow.
how Kelowilla has expanded and everything else you're
Wow.
doing. So really nice to see you again.
Wow.
But when you were beginning to, but at the beginning of your talk, I was thinking about how much what you said kind of resonated with, in some ways, what's going on in this country in terms of the tension between people who are working within systems to change it and people who are outside the systems. And I've been thinking a lot about kind of coalition building and, when you want the same things, when you're working inside the system versus outside the system, and how do we build those coalitions? Because I think to make the world the way I think many of us want to imagine it to be, I think it's really important for that kind of cross, like in the system and outside of the system, kind of work together. So I'm just wondering if you have thoughts on that, if you've done anything to kind of bridge that divide, because I think we need both, right? We need many of us who I think are working within systems, and the people kind of outside who are dreaming and activists and really engaged on the front lines of creating the world, at least I imagine. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I love that question. It's good to see you again.
Nice to
And
see you.
why I'm like smiling so wide is because everything that you just said is like the fodder for this next book that I've actually been working on right now, which is really about notions of solidarity, racial solidarity, but also economic solidarity. And what are the challenges to achieving that? And even in the context of race, we take it as a master status. But one of the learnings that I've had as I've been touring is, for many people, even within the Black community, this conversation that I'm trying to have around capitalism is a non-starter. They're like, "Ooh, work within the system, not possible." Like, hard stop, and so that gets in the way of, to your point, coalition building. Because I do believe that no matter what seat we're in, whether it's in the system, outside of it, there's a role for all of us to play in terms of that kind of economic solidarity, or even any kind of liberation in service of us. And so I think when you take the Black community, even if you treat Blackness as a master status in the case of race, you start to see the intra-racial differences that start to challenge and create cracks in how we can actually be in community with each other. Some of those differences might be ethnicity. It's a very different thing to be a Black American in this country than a Ghanaian American as myself. It's a very different thing to be a African descendant of slavery in this country as opposed to an immigrant. It's a very different thing to be a middle-class Black American in this country than, say, an affluent Black African in this country. And so all of those points of difference, I think, again, could be a really compelling way for us to connect. But I think more often than not, it becomes a point of division. And so some of the questions that I'm after now are, what is the enduring value of Blackness? Because I do believe that, because Blackness is a social position as well, if you account for the Black experience and you care for Black people globally, everybody benefits. And so what is the enduring value of that? But then also, how do we solve for those interracial differences that are then going to activate and open the door for economic solidarity? And so I've got no good answers yet, but come back to me in a year's time. Hopefully I'll have something to say worthwhile about that. But I'm with you. I think the coalition building is so critical. Yeah.
I'll chime in next. Thank you for hosting, Tim and Chris, for hosting today's discussion. And it's just so nice to just hear all the stories and to hear you share your story. Dr. Rachel, it's very inspiring. And I just want to just leave just a quick note just to say, I work in the social impact space. I'm consulting now, but I've spent about 24 years in the corporate space with really, really, really large companies. But what propelled me to get into this work about 21 years ago was I was a byproduct of a grant. And I just made a vow that I would do whatever I could to make the largest impact to everyone impacted. And I felt like the biggest way to do that was to work with the companies that had the most capital, which are some of our largest enterprises at some of these Fortune 100 companies. I really appreciate this discussion. And when you mention cognitive dissonance, I feel that that is a word that accompanies corporate social responsibility, social impact, philanthropy. That is a word that has become a cousin to these programs. And for some of us practitioners that lead these programs, these are some of the things we deal with on a daily basis. And so I just appreciate the continuing discussions, the alliances, the community, because it is definitely needed. And when I go build programs for some of these very large companies, I don't care how they feel about DEI or inclusion. I ensure that if we're going to build a program, we ensure that there's a system that will ensure that whatever the resources are get to the lowest person on the totem pole. And so I try to move them away from the word, which can be very contentious, and move them into the act of how do we demonstrate value. And if we're leaving out people or groups or organizations or communities, then we're really not building these really fulsome programs and doing what we say we're doing. So we need everyone in every capacity in the private sector, the public sector, and academia to really just come together and just continue this work to operate as advocates in this space. And I just appreciate the discussion because although we make strides, there's still so many obstacles, but with us as a community, we can talk about those obstacles and how we can help each other and give each other resources and inspiration, encouragement, because it's just a very difficult space to be in when you're a non-revenue generating business or program. So thank you for this. And I just wanted to kind of share that, but it's my personal, it's a personal goal of mine to ensure that it doesn't matter who the company is, that they build these programs in a way that everyone can benefit from it. And I'm just going to continue to press forward until we get there. So thank you for today's discussion.